Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Manny Minchell. I serve as Chief Impact Officer at the Jewish Federation for Greater Washington. It's an honor to welcome you to our fourth session of the Israel 75 virtual book series, co-sponsored by Jewish Federation and Moment Magazine as part of Federation's ongoing Israel 75 initiative. Federation is proud to partner with incredible institutions like Moment as we mark this milestone year of Israel's independence and to offer community members thought-provoking ways to engage with Israel during these complex times. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of diving into Ilana Kurshan's memoir, If All the Seas Were Ink. I remember when If All the Seas Were Ink was published, and so many of my friends and colleagues whose leadership in both Jewish communal service and Torah study I admire, ran out and picked up the copies and talked all about the book and how much it meant to them. So of course I picked up mine and I've enjoyed it. And the only problem is I can't get Ilana to sign it for me today. But it's a thrill to have you here. And just a little background, If All the Seas Were Ink is a memoir of a young, recently divorced American Israeli living in Jerusalem whose personal struggles lead her to take on the practice of Daf Yomi, reading a page of the Talmud every day for 7 years. Ilana Kurshan's inspiring memoir about learning how to put one foot in front of the next is a winner of the Sami Rohr Prize of Jewish Literature. Today, we'll be led by Amy Schwartz, Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a long-time editorial writer and an op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, covering education, science, and culture, and where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Please join me in welcoming Amy.
Thank you, Manny, and thanks to the Federation, as always, for doing this. And especially thank you to Ilana for coming out. It's evening in Israel, I understand, and the idea of the timing is that your kids are in bed, so we'll all keep our fingers crossed on that. Let me just do for a brief background. Ilana Kurshan, our guest today, has translated books of Jewish interest by Ruth Calderon, Benjamin Lau, Yemima Mizrahi, and Micah Goodman, as well as novels, short stories, and children's picture books. She's a regular contributor to Lilith magazine, where she is the book review editor, so my twin across the aisle. And her writing has appeared in The Forward, The World Jewish Digest, Hadassah, Nashim, Zeke, Kveller, and Tablet. Kurshan is a graduate of Harvard University with a BA, summa cum laude, History of Science, and a Cambridge University MPhil in English Literature. She teaches at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, where she lives with her husband and 5 children. Ilana, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. So my starting point here is I hope you will take as a tribute to the way your book made me think about time, because when I looked at the date it was published, my copy says it came out in 2017, and my first thought was, oh, we're almost through with the following cycle. We're 6 years after that cycle of Daf Yomi, so it's almost another complete cycle since this book came out. So I wonder if you would start by talking a little bit about Daf Yomi and how it came to be such a force and such a structure in your life.
Sure. Daf Yomi is an international program to study a page of Talmud a day, in which case you complete the entire Talmud in 7.5 years. The Babylonian Talmud is very long, as you can see. Basically, the way I came to this project, I never really intended to study Talmud. I didn't have any great interest in studying Talmud. I was, at the time when I began, I was living in Jerusalem, very far away from my family back in the States. I had recently gotten divorced, and I was feeling very lost, very sad and uncertain about the future. And at that time, the only thing that would get me out of bed in the morning was that I had a friend I used to go running with. And I remember one day we'd go running very early on the hills of Jerusalem. And one morning on our run, my friend mentioned to me that she had started learning Daf Yomi, and she thought maybe I would want to try it too. I remember looking at her like she was crazy. I had heard of Daf Yomi, but I didn't know anyone who learned it, men or women. And I couldn't imagine why I would want to learn all that Talmud. I thought of the Talmud as a compendium of Jewish law that was rather dry. I'd never really studied Talmud seriously before, although I had gone to a Jewish day school, a Salman Schachter school through the 8th grade. But that was really the last time that I had engaged with Jewish texts on a high level. And I also thought of the Talmud as very misogynist. As far as I knew, most of the women in the Talmud are either some rabbi's wife or daughter. Very few have independent identities. And I thought to myself, why would I want to commit all this time to studying the Talmud? And I remember my friend looked at me and she said, you know, Ilana, you're feeling so stuck right now. Don't you think that maybe, you know, you feel like everything is stuck in your life, that nothing is getting anywhere for you? Maybe if every day you learned one page of Talmud, then maybe a new chapter would start for you. And I remember thinking about that, and I thought, you know, that's really interesting. If every day I learned one page of Talmud, then with every passing day, I wouldn't just feel like I was, you know, just getting one day older or going nowhere, but every day I'd feel like I was getting one day wiser. And in fact, that's really, I think, the Jewish view of time. We view time as an opportunity to grow in wisdom. The rabbis say in Pirkei Avot, part of the Mishnah, they say that 5 is the age for beginning to learn Torah, 10 is the age for beginning to learn Mishnah, 15 is the age for beginning to learn Talmud, as if, you know, as we grow older, we have more and more opportunities to learn. Now, at that point in my life, I was almost twice the age the rabbis recommend for studying Talmud, but we also learn in Pirkei Avot, if not now, when? And I thought, okay, you know what do I have to lose? Maybe I'll give this a chance. And I started learning with a volume of Talmud that I borrowed from a friend. I didn't even think I was prepared to make enough of a commitment to buy a volume of Talmud. At that point, I was living in a rental apartment with a 6-month contract because I wasn't even certain if I'd be still living in Jerusalem in another longer than that. Everything in life felt so tenuous and uncertain. But very quickly, I found that learning a page of Talmud every day became my anchor, became the one thing that I knew that I would do every single day. And I discovered that everything I thought about the Talmud, I was very surprised by what I discovered. I had thought of the Talmud as I said, a very dry book of Jewish law, but I discovered that the Talmud is really, it's not a book for people who have found all the answers. It's not a book that tells you what to do as a Jew. It's really a book about living the questions. It's a book in which most of the questions are left open and undecided. And it's really the rabbis debating, what do we do in certain situations with this often very cacophonous sort of medley of voices. I don't know if that's a contradiction in terms, but but a lot of rabbis sort of everyone stating their own opinion and no one agreeing with anyone else. And I felt like that sort of, you know, uncertainty and sort of trying to figure things out very much spoke to where I was in my life. And so that's how I came to Daf Yomi. And I also discovered, because I was living in Jerusalem, while initially I began learning just on my own in my apartment. Sometimes I would listen to recorded classes on the internet. But at some point I realized, you know, I was living in Jerusalem, like the capital of Jewish learning. I should get myself to a class. And I started learning in a class that met at 6 a.m. in a local synagogue. I was the only woman in the class. And I think I brought down the average age by about 30 years. It was all retirees who, I don't know, got up early to learn, and me. And I was also the only person who took notes. I took a lot of notes in pencil in the margins. Once I bought my own volume of Talmud, I took copious notes. And I remember the other men in the class used to tease me and say, why are you writing in pencil? You should write in pen. Maybe someday someone's going to want to publish all your notes. Well, they didn't know how prescient that was. But yeah, so I started taking this class, and very quickly Daf Yomi became not just an anchor, but also my community, because even when I was learning, even on those days when I was learning all alone by myself, when you learn Daf Yomi, you're never really alone, because tens of thousands of people the whole world over are learning Daf Yomi. And the idea behind Daf Yomi, which was founded in 1923 by Rebbe Meir Shapira, the head of the Lublin Yeshiva, the idea behind Daf Yomi is that everyone who's learning is on the same page, and there's a schedule so that everyone finishes at the same time in 7.5 years have elapsed. So it was really part of a very large community of learners. And then I had all these incidents where I'd be learning on an airplane, and I'd be on an El Al flight, and the person next to me would also be learning, and we were literally on the same page. And I very soon discovered that I wasn't as alone as I had felt, and Daf Yomi really became for me community as well. And after that, I just kept learning and learned through all that happened to me as I recovered from the dissolution of my marriage, as I began dating again, as I got married a few years later, had children, and what have you. And through all of it, the daily page of Talmud I studied really became the backdrop, or sort of the soundtrack to my life. And I took extensive notes as I was learning, and those notes eventually became the backbone for the book I wrote.
And you were journaling as well, right? You seem
Yeah,
to
journals, blog posts. Oh, yes. Not just notes in the margins of my volumes of Talmud, but I've always kept journals. I've kept journals since I was, I think, in second grade. I was trying to remember, because I have a daughter in first grade who keeps two journals, one for her short stories and one for records of her day. I think I only had one. She surpassed me already. But I think I started in second grade keeping journals. And I would write. I've always written about, wherever my head is, and often my head is in whatever book I'm reading. So for as long as I can remember, my journals have always been as much about whatever I was reading as what I was doing. And as a lot of what I was reading became Talmud, I very naturally started writing a lot about Talmud and about the intersections between what I was learning and what was happening in my life. And so, yes, the journals, and then a friend created for me an anonymous blog. And I began just putting everything I was writing, everything I wrote, onto that blog. It was under a pseudonym, and I didn't tell anyone about it, but it was just a way for me to keep all my writing organized. And then 7.5 years later, when I had 3 very young children, I had just given birth to twins. I was about to complete my first 7.5 year cycle. And a friend said to me, "What are you going to do to mark this momentous occasion? You've just finished going through the whole Talmud." And I said to her, "Well, maybe I should put all my writing together." And it was putting together the blog posts, the journal entries, the notes, and my volumes of Talmud. That was really the genesis of the book.
and you thought, oh, I have a book, right? So
Yeah, I just really sat down and started making a list of every essay or article that I had written. And very soon it became clear that, of course, since I had learned the Talmud consists of 37 volumes, or tractates, as they're known, Masechtot. Since I had learned, I had learned the Masechtot in order. So the story of my life sort of neatly unfolded against the backdrop of those 37 volumes of the Talmud. So every chapter became one of those volumes. And of course, there were periods when I wrote less, and then I had to combine 2 into 1, because I didn't have as many notes from that period, or I had to reconstruct by, trying to remember where I was and where did I learn that, and looking back at my notes. I often would write the date on the top of the page of Talmud that I learned it. So that was helpful, and just, the way one writes journal entries. So yes, so that's how the organizational scheme emerged.
I will note, for people who haven't read the book, that one of the fun interludes that you also do is sometimes you try to capture what you've been studying in a limerick. So every so often,
Yes.
It's not just a journal entry; you have these little limericks dotting about the Talmud. So
yes, that was another project. I felt that, when you're studying Talmud at the rate of a page a day, it may not seem like a lot, because reading a novel at the rate of a page a day seems, a snail's pace, right? But when you're studying Talmud, there's, first of all, a page is, it's really a folio, right? It's back and front. It's very, very dense and full of commentaries. Not only are the margins lined with commentaries, but there are more commentaries in the back, right? The commentary really spills over and continues even beyond, the publication of any single volume of Talmud. That process of commenting on the Talmud is really an ongoing process. So there's so much one can learn. I actually remember once sitting next to someone on an airplane. I mentioned this before. I had a lot of Daf Yomi conversations on airplanes because you're stuck sitting next to someone for a long time. And if you learn Daf Yomi, and they do, then at some point everyone's going to pull out their volume of Talmud so they don't get behind, especially if you're, traveling whatever against or the international date line and you're losing a day or whatever it is. You have to be really careful not to fall behind. But anyway, so I had this conversation with someone who said to me, he said to me, what are you learning? You're on the wrong page. And I said, oh, I'm getting ahead because I'm going on a trip for work. I won't have time. So I'm trying to go ahead. And he said to me, go ahead. I would never do that. If I have extra time, I read all the commentaries. I read the page again. I try to understand everything that perplexed me the first time. And I said, well, that's one way of doing it, but that's not how I do it. So that is to say that, there's really, there's so much in a page of Talmud. I don't remember what you asked me. I'm sorry.
No. I was going to go back and say the two things that jump out.
Oh, the limericks, right? Sorry, I remember. You asked about the limericks.
Did you want to say anything more about that? I was just admiring it.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say so because there's so much material, it's very hard to remember what you're learning. And I find that it's very easy to remember things in rhyme. It's always easy to remember songs and poetry. So I started writing limericks as a mnemonic, as a way of just remembering what I was learning, so that I would be able to summon ideas and themes and characters, rabbis, stories. And I tried to write one limerick for every page I learned. It wasn't consistent. There were times I wrote one limerick a day more consistently than others, for sure. But the goal was to have something I could sort of hold on to and remember from every page I learned. So that's how the limerick project began. I initially had this idea to publish a book of limericks, but someone told me that no one would ever buy a book like that. And before I had the idea, I said, oh, maybe I should just collect all my limericks. And then I thought, okay, so I'll do prose instead. That makes more sense.
I mean, I'm picturing one of those little booklets you can buy like next to the cash register, addendum to if all the seasonal ink in limericks.
Right. I've discovered since then that I am not the only one, that other people have written limericks about the Talmud too since. I don't know if, I don't know when, but I've definitely encountered others because it's a very good way of remembering what you're learning.
It's sort of like writing a headline, right? You have to figure out what the main idea is, and
Yeah, either the main idea or pick up on one of the many ideas.
So two things occurred to me just about the origin story, because we'll move on. But one is, that's some friend, who could see so far ahead as to what you needed. That's a pretty good thing right there. But also, I think a difference, one of the things I was thinking as I was reading this was you obviously went in with the skills to do this. And I know that Daf Yomi's changed a lot over time, possibly even because of this book, but in the most recent cycle there were many more ways for people to get into it. There are many more translations. It's more accessible to women and so forth. And maybe we could talk about that. But I wonder if you would sort of talk about what you needed in order to jump in even at a relatively basic level. Were you reading these things in English or in Hebrew or Aramaic?
That's a really good question. So I like to think of the Talmud, and the rabbis compare the Talmud to a vast ocean. And just like with an ocean, you can skim the surface, you can go underwater a little bit, right? You can dive down a little deeper, or you can become a deep sea diver and get to know all the flora and fauna on the ocean floor. I think it's similar with Talmud, that you can engage with Talmud on a more superficial level, but you can also engage with it very, very deeply. And so for me, the way I started learning, it was very important to me to learn in Hebrew, especially because I had recently come to Israel, and I had pretty strong Hebrew. So I learned with a volume of Talmud that was that had commentary in modern Hebrew by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who passed away only recently. A tremendous scholar who really made the Talmud accessible to so many. So I used that modern Hebrew translation, which I would consult whenever I was confused or the more traditional commentators weren't helpful. In the beginning, I was really just reading through the Talmud with his commentary every day. I didn't even try to understand anything on my own. But in a way, reading with that commentary, that voice, that commentary sort of became my chavruta, my study partner. The Talmud is meant to be studied in, out loud with others. It's a very dialogical text. It unfolds as a series of conversations. So that was very helpful to have a commentary that was accessible to me. In some ways, I found it was easier for me than learning in English because the Talmud is written in Hebrew and in Aramaic, which has a lot of cognates with Hebrew. And so there was less of an interpretive leap into English. So that made it easier. I also, like I said, I would go to classes, and I think that was very helpful to be able to ask questions. Although I will say that I was very, very wary for a long time of opening my mouth at all. I remember thinking, oh my goodness, everyone in this room has been studying Talmud for so much longer than I have and has so much more background. I shouldn't say a thing. Anything I say, I'll sound so stupid. But lo habayshan lomed, like you can't learn if you're embarrassed, as the rabbis say, or if you're shy. You have to, get over yourself. So I did begin asking questions, and I would look things up. It's true that there were not nearly as many resources as there are today. I remember I wanted to listen to a recorded class when I couldn't go to my regular class. And the only classes I could find were in very heavy Yiddish inflected English. I wanted to listen to a class in English, and it was so hard because I would listen, and often I just couldn't even make out the accents. And eventually, I switched to listening in Hebrew just because it was easier for me to follow.
The Steinsaltz translation into modern Hebrew has also been done into English now. Right?
Yes, it's been done in English. Recently it was completed, and now it's on a website called Sefaria, the full English translation, and it's very accessible. Of course, every translation is commentary, and so you really do have to read the original to unpack or be exposed to the full range of meanings. Of course, all translation is interpretation, but I think yes. Rav Steinsaltz and Sefaria have done a huge amount in making Talmud accessible, and also it's the Koren publishers which translated it into English. So yes, there are many resources. There are also now podcasts of women teaching Talmud, women teaching Daf Yomi in English. More and more women are teaching. More and more women are learning. I think we are certainly over time, as more and more people of all different backgrounds have been engaging with this text. Not only are there more resources out there, but we're also, I believe, we're uncovering new faces of Torah. Right? The rabbis famously say that Torah has 70 faces, shivim panim la Torah. And the more we learn, the more faces, aspects. If you think of like, I don't know, a polyhedron or whatever, I think that's what it's called, with all the different sides. You can't see all the sides at once, but as more and more people learn, we uncover more of those aspects, more perspectives on the text, and certainly adding women's voices into text in which the rabbis very often think they know what they're talking about when it comes to women's bodies and women's psychology and women's preferences and women's desires. Right, hearing women today responding to male rabbinic assumptions about those texts is very eye-opening.
I wonder if you would want to give an example of that, and if you
sure,
let's have one, and then I have a more specific question on that anyway.
Yeah. So yeah.
For you.
So one of my favorite examples is a phrase that occurs several times in the Talmud, and it's an Aramaic phrase about how the rabbis say that unlike a man, a woman would much rather be married than unmarried, to a much greater extent than a man, such that she will basically do anything so as to be married. And at one point, the rabbis explain what they mean by this, and they say, oh, well, the reason a woman goes to such lengths to want to be married is because then if she wants to commit, adulterous, if she wants to, be with other men too, she can hide behind the fact that she's married, right? And it all looks like it's, more kosher. Okay, so you can say that's completely appalling, but this is an assumption, and it underlies how marriage contracts are negotiated, for example, how divorce is negotiated, the sense that like the man has the advantage because the woman is more invested in remaining married. And I remember reading this at a time when I was recently divorced and really, really uncertain about what I wanted for my life. And I remember reading this text at a time when my friends kept saying to me, like, hey, we're going to this party tonight. Why don't you come? And oh, there's a singles event. Don't you want to go? And at the time, I really just had no interest in anything like that. I just wanted to focus on my learning and work and just be left alone. And I thought about that idea from the Talmud. I also thought about there was a rabbi from the time of the Mishnah named Shimon ben Azai. Actually, he wasn't properly a rabbi, but a scholar. And he used to always get in trouble with his colleagues because he was an outspoken advocate for the importance of the mitzvah of procreation, but he himself did not have any children. And the rabbis asked him, you always say it's so important, this mitzvah, to have children, but you don't have any children. And he said, his answer to them was, what can I do? My soul desires Torah. Basically, I need all my time to learn. And the world is going to have to be sustained by other people, he said. And I remember also very much identifying with that at a period in my life when the greatest intimacy in my life was intimacy with the text, that I spent tremendous amounts of time trying to delve into, uncover, get to know better, almost the way one would, try to get to know, it was like a courtship of sorts. So I read those texts in a very different light, given where I was in my life.
That's absolutely lovely, actually. I like that idea. So let me ask you a related question, but I'm going to frame it a little differently. So obviously, it's not a spoiler to say that by the end of this memoir, you're the mother of 3 children. I noticed when I read the acknowledgments at the end of it, you mentioned you have 4 children, and then when we did the intro just now you have 5 children. So there's childbearing and child rearing are obviously a big part of all this. And one of my favorite scenes in this memoir is when you're trying to nurse twins, and you don't want to nurse them at the same time because you want to keep a hand free for your volume of Talmud so you won't fall behind. And I was just lost in admiration at this, because when I was nursing, I could barely loft a volume of Harry Potter, which was what was going on at the time. But so rather than ask a stereotypical question about how you juggled, all this Torah learning with child rearing, let me turn it around. How do family life and this kind of learning enrich each other? Does learning with children and while raising children, does that change the endeavor? Are there things in the Talmud that come across differently?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely felt like I read text differently when it was against sort of in the context of birthing children, raising children, for sure. I remember when my twins were, actually, it's funny, my daughter is here and she just said, I'm one of the twins. She's now 10. But I remember when they were very young. One of them, I have twin girls, and one of them began crawling long before her sister. And also teething long before her sister, and the one who was teething sooner used to bite her sister all the time, and bite her sister and sort of run away from her sister, and her poor sister could just sort of lie there.
The one who's listening, or the other one?
No, she's gone now.
Oh, too bad. I was going to ask.
I wouldn't tell the story. She went away.
Go ahead.
I won't say.
Okay.
Anyway. And in the Talmud, in the tractate on the laws of torts and laws of damages, talks about what happens, the difference, but this is also in the Torah, the difference between an ox that has never, in sort of innocent ox that has never gored anyone before. If an ox like that gores another animal, the level of responsibility is lower than if an ox that is known for goring gores another animal, because the assumption is that the owner of that ox was forewarned because by the ox's past behavior, should have been more vigilant. So we began referring to my daughter with the teeth as the goring ox, and not in English, but using the language of the Talmud. And it became sort of like our code name for her. Yeah. So I definitely felt like, there were, or I remember also, I would think about, there was, I think I write it. Yeah, I write about this in the book, that one time my son, when he was 2, my oldest is a boy. He had this stuffed elephant that he used to take with him everywhere he went. And he would take it to preschool in the morning and then bring it home in the afternoon. And once it got lost, and of course, disaster. Imagine this has happened to other people.
All of us can relate to.
Yes. And so we very quickly scrambled and found an identical one and gave it to him. And then his preschool teacher found the original that had gotten lost. It was in one of the other kids' like cubbies. And she gave it to my son. And my son was so confused, like which was the real elephant and why were there 2? And it really helped me to understand this concept in the Talmud about what happens if a person designates an animal as a sacrifice to offer in the temple, and then that animal gets lost and the person designates another animal, and that animal becomes the sacred one. But then the original animal is found. What do you do? And the ruling is that you have to sacrifice both. So it's very interesting. Like that really made me think about sort of my son's relationship to these to these stuffed elephants. So all that is to say that I think I guess the sort of metaphorical range was expanded by, I think it's expanded by any experiences one has, but in my case, many of my metaphors came from child rearing. And I would definitely, I remember I would read to my children, like I often read aloud to them while I was breastfeeding, because it was a way of, I wanted them to hear my voice, and I always felt like it always felt a little inappropriate that I was not at all focused on them. My head was always in the book. So I felt less guilty if I read aloud to them, as if somehow we were all in it together. We were all more in the same experience, in the same headspace. But I read aloud to my children all the time when they were little, also while they were falling asleep. Like I was always reading to them. I also really enjoy reading out loud. What's
from
that?
The Talmud, or just in general?
From the Talmud, from whatever I was reading, chanting from the Torah, from novels, poetry, whatever I was reading. But a lot of what I read, because I read a page of Talmud a day, was Talmud. So I would read aloud to them for sure. Yes. And I often think about, the fact that they really, really imbibe Torah with their mother's milk, like very, 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 it's often used as a metaphor, but for in my case, in my children's case, it was very, very literally so. And I really do think a lot about what text I expose my children to, what it's important for me that they learn, what aspects of my learning are important for me to share with them. And I think that's definitely a large part of the kinds of conversations that we have.
Well, I wonder if, this is about the book, but to bring it up to date a little, you do talk a lot in the book toward the end, and in dialogue with Talmud on this topic, about how to model, your Jewish lives for children, how to model a life of observance and study, and how both you and your husband, what kind of messages you want to convey. And I'm curious, you're well into it now. Your oldest is, you said, sort of approaching bar mitzvah age. How is that? How do you see that coming out in them? Do they study, or other, just in general? Has the modeling? Do you feel like you can see the modeling taking effect?
Oh, I don't know. I definitely feel like the best I can do for them is, as you said, just to model my own passion and not try to force it upon them. I do, my son and I try to learn a Mishnah together every night. My children, they study Jewish subjects in school. So it just, tonight I was helping my daughter with her homework from the Book of Judges. So we're often talking about Torah in our home. And I think also that's, in some ways, it's not just from the home, because I'm raising my kids in Israel. My kids are all in public school, but they learn Jewish subjects in their Jewish public school. And they, a lot of the way that other subjects are taught is through Jewish texts. So just to give an example, the way kids learn to read, at least in my kids' school, the way they learn to read was that every week they're given on Friday a page about the weekly Torah portion. And, when they're in first grade, it has like 3 or 4 words, like names from the Torah portion, but they have to read it. And, they have every week, they have a page they have to read. And as they get older, those pages get longer. Now my son is in 6th grade and it's a double-sided page with paragraphs and fairly small print, but he still has to read every week to us. And we have to sign it before he goes back to school on Sunday. So that's definitely been a large part of their education and also of the discourse in our home. My husband and I enjoy studying together. We both take classes in our free time, and I teach. He also teaches, but doesn't teach Jewish subjects. But we're both teachers, and our kids very much are aware of that. I really do try to model that commitment to learning and to teaching, but more importantly, just a love of learning, in the hope that it will be infectious. And sometimes it seems more so, and sometimes less so. But I'm also aware that my children are their own people, and my passions won't necessarily be their passions. And really, above all, I would be thrilled if they came to love the text that I love, but I hope they'll come to love something with the intensity that I love what I have the privilege of doing. And I'll feel very grateful if that happens.
That's a nice thought.
Yeah.
So to go back to the question of modeling a little bit, some of the, as you alluded to, some of these scenes in public, when you're learning Talmud on a plane, or you're learning in a line waiting for a plane, or on a bus, and sometimes you're attracting sort of surprised attention from women who wonder why you're doing it, and also from men who don't see that. Obviously, it sounds like obviously you navigate, both egalitarian and non-egalitarian communities. It sounds like, and I guess in some places you don't talk about this really at all in the book, but I guess in some places, that access, that kind of equal access, is fraught, right? Is not universally, people aren't universally comfortable with it. How if at all did you experience that? How did you navigate? I know you talk about how you daven in a traditional egalitarian community and you lead services and so forth, but how do you manage in the broader landscape?
Yeah, I think I've been relatively very lucky in the sense that not only have I not encountered very much pushback, I think also just the circles in which I travel are very accepting of and receptive to women's engagement with and contributions to Jewish learning. But I think I'm also very lucky in the sense that I didn't really grow up with any sort of chip on my shoulder about how women have been historically treated by rabbinic culture, how women are depicted in rabbinic texts. I grew up in a home in which everything men could do, women could do, and vice versa. Both my parents are professionals who work in the Jewish community, both in leadership capacities. And those were the models I had when I was growing up. And so when I came to study Talmud, and I discovered that most of the women in the Talmud spend their time sorting lentils or gossiping with other women by the moonlight or birthing children, and with very few exceptions, they don't study Torah, they don't engage with learning, and they're very much dependents, women who have to or who are beholden either to their fathers or to their husbands. That did not infuriate me. It didn't alienate me. It didn't upset me, which are all responses that many of my peers have had. And I think the reason is because of the way I grew up. I didn't carry that chip on my shoulder. I didn't have this baggage, these grievances. And I said to myself, okay, well, in these texts, women appear very differently. And the way women appear in these texts, basically women are kind of like an extinct species. Like, I don't know any women like this. All the women I know have their own bank accounts, and they're financially independent, and they have professions and careers, and if they have families, it's a choice they've made, like, thank God. And I instead, when I studied these texts, it wasn't with this reaction of outrage and umbrage, but rather of celebration. Like, I would read these texts and say, wow, I am so lucky to be born a Jewish woman in modern times, right? Like, I am so lucky to be living in the Jewish world in the 21st century. What a gift that I can engage with these texts, that they are as accessible to me as they are to men. And I think for me, that has felt like something only to embrace, to celebrate. And so I think that affected the whole attitude I brought to these texts. And on those rare occasions when I encountered people who perhaps were less comfortable with the notion of women studying Talmud, I didn't hesitate to explain what I was doing and why I was doing it, and how I really did feel like I was contributing to the expansion and the growth of Torah, and I really do believe that. So I think that coming to the text with this approach was very liberating, empowering, and enabled me to engage creatively without having to sort of overcome all my own issues before I did that. And it just enabled me to dive in much more quickly and much more fully.
It's interesting that you say that in Jerusalem too, where, I mean, so you're not interacting with, I guess what in America we call Haredi communities, where it might be much more visible to see women who maybe aren't experiencing modern times the way you are, or maybe they are, and I'm stereotyping. Do you have a sense of that?
So it's not the neighborhood I live in, and it's not the circles I travel in on a regular basis. I do buy my books. I buy my volumes of Talmud and other religious texts in religious neighborhoods. And yes, I will be honest, there are times I've had to pretend I'm buying a book for my husband when I'm buying it for myself, just to make the experience more comfortable. But that doesn't bother me. I feel like, to me, it seems that the Jewish world and the world of Jewish learning is moving towards a place of greater egalitarianism, because that's the trajectory of the larger world. And it just seems so obvious to me that if women are equal to men in, I don't know, in boardrooms and in lecture halls and in universities and wherever, and law firms, and then why shouldn't women be equal to men in synagogues and places of Jewish study? And that the world has changed, and I'm really excited to be part of that. And in many ways, I mean, this is a much larger. I don't know if there's time to go into this now, but I can just say, like, on one foot, that I do, over time, I have come to believe and see evidence that I think our texts are aware of that too, and that in the ideal. In sort of like in the original creation story, Adam and Eve are created as one being. Simultaneously, and that in the original creation story, the sun and the moon are equal in size when they are initially created, at least as the Midrash depicts it. And it's all these later accounts where Adam is created first, the sun is the larger one, what have you. And I do really believe that we are moving towards a place of greater egalitarianism, and it's not as radical a move as we think. In some ways, it's going back to the way the world was created to be.
So Torah, in other words, so Talmud also reveals an egalitarian face, in other words, among its many faces. you're finding somewhere in there?
I don't know if I can go that far. I hope so. But I definitely think that if we prevent women from engaging with these texts, I do think we are depriving ourselves of insights into Torah that we would otherwise not have access to.
Mhm.
Um, I think that is true.
It's a vision of hope. This is ordinarily this isn't where I would ask you what if anything you're working on next, but it seems like an obvious segue. I'll go back to other questions. But so, are you working on this question at all? Are you writing anything new?
I have written about that question, but specifically what I'm working on, I've been working now on a project about reading texts with children, both Jewish texts and secular texts, and how we relate to our children through literature, how we learn to read our children as texts. By reading with our children. It began from trying to teach my Israeli Hebrew speaking children how to read in English during the pandemic, and spending a lot of time reading and studying both Jewish and secular texts with my children. And it also emerged from the realization, as I mentioned earlier, of how much my children's own experience of reading emerged through their engagement with Bible study, with weekly Torah study. So it's a project that unfolds against the backdrop of the 5 books of Moses, but sort of argues or has its underlying assumption that all literature is commentary on literature that came before. And the book that we as Jews most commonly, most frequently read and reread and come back to again and again and gather together around its stories is the Torah, is the Bible, is the 5 books of Moses. So that's what I've been working on now. I think I'm very aware as my children are getting older of sort of the potential and the limitations of what I model for them. Just this past Shabbat, we go to a synagogue that starts quite early, and my children were still asleep, so we left them all at home. And my husband and I went to synagogue, and I was sort of hoping, it's very close to our house, I was hoping they would come. My oldest is now, actually this week he just turned 12, so they're getting older. My youngest is 3, so I was hoping they would all come together, but they didn't. And as I was sitting there, I thought, oh, what a shame they didn't come. And then I came home and I was walking up the steps to our apartment, and I heard this beautiful sound of singing, of prayer. And there are a lot of apartments in our building. And as I went up each level, we live on the top floor, I thought, oh, that can't be coming from my apartment. My children wouldn't daven so beautifully. They wouldn't pray like that of their own initiative. They're probably still sleeping or eating breakfast. And each time I got higher and higher, I kept hearing that beautiful sound. And sure enough, my children had created a little synagogue in our living room. We have a little Torah scroll, and they had opened it and they were pretending to chant from it. And they had taken out all the prayer books. Everyone had a book, including my 3-year-olds, and they had gotten dressed in Shabbat clothes. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was absolutely flabbergasted. And that really made me think about sort of, I never told them that, we always tell them we'd like them to try to come meet us in synagogue in the morning. As I said, it's pretty early, so they're not always all up. But for me, that was just so moving and so powerful. So I'm sort of interested in exploring what we model for our children in terms of our passions, and the role that texts and literature play in the rearing of children.
That is really interesting. First of all, what a lovely story, but also, yeah, that's a book I want to read, and yeah, so obviously that's so it all comes together. So one of the, just to wrap up, I think we're almost out of time, although not quite. As regulars of the series have noticed, the idea of the series is to give people insight into Israel in ways, through literary texts in ways that they wouldn't get in any other way. So you've alluded to aspects of this, but I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on, what kinds of mean, because you're, engaged in study and you're, in observant communities, you maybe have access to a different slice of Israel, even as a, as an American who made Aliyah, than some of the other authors we've read. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the communities, the aspects of Israel that are illuminated through the kind of life you're living and through study? I mean, what's it like, studying Talmud in Israel as opposed to studying it, elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I'll say, I think, first of all, part of what I love most about living where I live can be encapsulated just by the billboards on the street when you. So I'm a runner, as you know, as I began with my running story. I'm still an early morning runner, and I always read the billboards when I run, in whatever neighborhood I'm running in. And in Jerusalem, the billboards are full of advertisements for lectures by great rabbis, plays by great Yiddish writers, someone talking about, great Jewish short stories, what have you. That is to say that the discourse surrounding Jewish texts is very much a part of popular culture here. And so when a person wants to go out for fun, right, there are countless lectures, classes about Torah that a person can go to and that people do go to. And it's very much a culture that respects and even valorizes learning. And that's something that has always made me feel very at home here. I often say I didn't really make Aliyah to Israel, I made Aliyah to Jerusalem. And that I really found not just a spiritual home, but also really an intellectual home here, where just I feel very fortunate that so many of the people I meet and interact with share my passions and my commitment to learning. When I first came to Israel, actually for about a decade, I worked at a literary agency. I worked in foreign rights, selling rights to translate books into Hebrew from other languages. I read about some little in the book. I would travel to international book fairs, meet with agents and publishers all over the world. And I always worked, because I worked with a lot of American clients. So I would study in the morning, and then because of the time difference, I would come to work in the middle of the day and then work into the night. And no one ever raised any eyebrows. This was before COVID and flexible work and what have you. And I didn't have a family at the time. I didn't really have an excuse for working irregular hours, proper excuse, but it was really important to me to take time to study. And that was seen as perfectly acceptable. And often I would take a bus to the university in the mornings and take a class, not for credit, just Talmud class, whatever it was I was interested in learning, Midrash. And I felt so fortunate that I lived in a place where that was not only understood and forgiven, but really accepted and celebrated. Maybe I'm just really lucky. But so that was always a part of my experience. And also in terms of another part of what I love about living here is just the diversity of religious experiences that are open. I always joke that, when you're going to synagogue on Shabbat morning, no matter where you're going, you're going to pass at least 3 or 4 other synagogues on the way, because, there are like multiple synagogues on every block in Jerusalem, pretty much. And so my husband grew up in an Orthodox synagogue. I grew up in a conservative synagogue. When we sort of had different kinds of prayer communities that felt comfortable to both of us, but that was never an issue, because he would go to his shul and I would go to mine. And, we'd come back 2 hours later and have lunch together. And, it wasn't, your shul in Israel is it's not your community in the same way. It's not the be all and end all of your Jewish community, because your Jewish life is all around you, and Jewish life is, it's on the billboards and in the supermarkets that only sell kosher food and have all the, featured food for the next holiday on sale in front, or prices marked up or whatever it is, anyway. So that was that. So I think that pressure of sort of like having to choose one community, like religious community, was off, and that was very liberating too. And it's interesting because we over time we do pray in the same synagogue, and it's largely because we managed to find a shul that is both fully egalitarian and also very, very fast. So he wanted fast, I wanted egalitarian. We're both very happy. But I think that's just a testament to the range of options that are out there. So yeah, so I think it's about, for me, living here, living in Jerusalem, and specifically in the neighborhood where I live, because of course this is not true in all parts of Jerusalem. It's just living among people who share my commitment to taking one's religious life very, very seriously, but also, and I don't want to say but, and also engaging fully with the modern world, and not seeing those as necessarily being in tension, but really seeing the potentials for each one to enrich and uncover aspects of the other.
Is that community, people who are doing that, is that largely, well, I mean, are there a lot of people who were born in America in that community and made Aliyah?
Yes, but not exclusively, for sure. I think that is a part of that community. I think a lot of it is the American influence, but on the religious scene here, for sure. But I think that it is more and more taking root. The fact that it's not entirely indigenous does leave it sort of, fault lines. There's definitely, not everything has taken root as naturally or as smoothly as one might hope. But I do think that that the influx of certainly American immigrants has changed the religious landscape for good.
Good. Well, it's 2:00 exactly, and I think that's a nice note to end on. I'm going to bring back Manny, but I want to say thank you so much for talking with us, and it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I can't wait to see what you write next.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a pleasure for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Ilana, for this illuminating conversation, for bringing us into such a personal account of both your authorship and really your life. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today. As one of our listeners today shared, Ilana speaks like she writes. I love the book and I love this recording. I've observed that when my friends and neighbors are exposed more and more to Daf Yomi and the Talmud, they grow intrigue. And I'm confident, Ilana, that you're inviting us into your encounter with the Talmud and its cacophonous medley of voices will likely create more space for our viewers and listeners, and hopefully a more inclusive and experienced Talmud and Torah landscape. Amy, really appreciate your thoughtful facilitation of this rich conversation and helping us explore the memoir today. Of course, our Israel at 75 programs are well underway. Today's the fourth of five, the five-part virtual book series. And we invite you all to join us back on Monday, June 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern for our next and final session of the virtual book series, where we will encounter the late Ronit Matalon's And the Bride Closed the Door with Dr. Shulamit Reinhartz. Please be on the lookout for the registration link and join us. And I'll encourage you all to find opportunities to participate and engage in Israel 75 programs, whether at JCCs or synagogues, restaurants, or local organizations, as we celebrate this milestone year. Thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.